Well, hello, Beyond Rome listeners. Welcome back. I am here with a very special guest. Yarden, welcome to Beyond Rome.
Thank you very much for having me. It is absolutely a privilege, and I've been following the podcast very regularly, and you do very, very good work.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm missing today my co host, James O'Reilly, but he is in the midst of planning for our next Catholic VIP trip to Israel. So I cannot give him too much of a hard time, but he is missing you, Yarden, and looks forward to meeting you in Israel. So Yarden is a very interesting man. He is an Israeli Jew who is a convert to the Catholic faith. So I am really looking forward to hearing about who you are, your background, and also a little bit about your conversion story. So I'll let you take it away there. Tell us a little bit about yourself. At least introduce, who you are.
Yeah, so Yarden, for anybody who doesn't know, is just the Hebrew Yarden, the Hebrew original, I guess you could say, version of Jordan, like the Jordan River.
Oh, nice.
James was the name I took on in my when I was baptized. Um, and yeah, born and raised in Israel, right here in Tel Aviv, to a very regular. I'll give you a pretty short version because this is a 16-year story. So we could be
Yes.
here for quite a while potentially.
Tell
Uh,
everyone who you are, like today, like just today, like
so
where
today
you
I'm
live, what
just,
you do. Yes.
thank you for calling me special, but I'm a very regular Catholic parishioner in the Jaffa Hebrew Keilah parish, essentially. Um, Converted to Catholicism from being a secular Jew, and I was actually one of Jehovah's Witnesses for about a decade in between. Um, and today, my main passion, I think I could say, within the church is exploring with friends what Jewish identity might look like today and in the future within the church. And actually, you touched
Mhm.
upon that in a couple of previous episodes you did lately. Um, and as you know, it can be a very, you kind of have to dance between the raindrops,
Yes.
but it's very exciting work that I think will positively impact both Jews and Gentiles within the church.
That's incredible. It's definitely one of Philo's Catholic's goals is to re-Judaize the Catholic faith, which is a very exotic way of saying that we want to live as authentic Catholics, a richness and an abundance of the Catholic faith in by tapping into our Jewish roots, which St. Paul reminds us to do and to do deeply. So I when I think about you, Yarden, I think it's such an interesting because identity can be sometimes complex. I mean, I've talked to you about how I have the American thing, but I'm also from Egyptian culture, but my blood is Armenian and Syrian, and so there's all these different parts to our identity and our personalities. Raised in a Roman Catholic context, but still Eastern, right? So there's just all these layers. And I think with Middle Eastern people like ourselves or Near Eastern people it has another dimension of kind of
Yeah.
nuance and complication. But to me, just in the short time I've had the privilege to know you, you feel like a Catholic, which is like a very funny thing to say because not all Catholics feel Catholic to me, which may be offensive and, making a judgmental statement. But when I talk to you, I'm like, wow, this guy, he's fully Catholic. I get him. I feel like we share the same heart. You make sense to me as a Catholic, but you're also fully Jewish and Israeli, which is just such a neat just like place that you hold and such a like high privilege that you hold to be part of the faith and also part of the chosen people in a particular way. So can you say a little bit more before I kind of ask you about your conversion story? Can you say a little bit more about that? I'm just hearing you speak, that sounds like your personal vocation is to, when John Paul II says we need to breathe with both lungs, that when leaders in the church say that we're not Gnostic, right, that we have to return to our roots, you are in this like prophetic moment, especially with all of the geopolitical difficulties that we're going through and also the ecclesial challenges that we're going through. You're in this like extremely prophetic moment to live out your personal vocation, which is highly, highly needed. So if you could just say a few words about that.
Yeah, I think most people listening to that are probably very confused and don't really know how to piece together everything you just said. And anybody who feels that way, I just want to say you've hit the nail on the head, because the tensions, I think for everybody, all Christians in the Middle East now, but I think especially for Christians of Jewish stock, the tensions can be overwhelming. Certain moments where you just want to give up half of who you are just to make life
Yeah.
a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Um, but then other times you just feel enormously privileged. So, for example, I have three sons. All of them are circumcised. We just had one a couple of days ago, and even the guy doing the circumcision was a Christian. It was
Amazing.
and the godfather, my best friend, is Christian as well. He's Catholic, and there was a really unique sense, unique feeling in that moment, knowing we're linking the baby to 3,500 years of tradition that you can
Mm-hmm.
say is ethnic, you can say is cultural, and that's all true, but you can't really devoid that of the spiritual
Mm-hmm.
baggage that it has. That's a very positive baggage. And then January 1st is the baptism, and we're just
Mm-hmm.
introducing him to these covenants one after another.
Right.
Um, yeah, it's an enormous privilege to be part of both groups. Where it can get difficult is that Jews are one of the only ethnic groups, maybe not one of the only, but is one of the ethnic groups that don't really have an authentic expression of Christianity today. There
Mm-hmm.
used to be an authentic expression of that, and it died out for uh, different reasons. Um, so today it can be very difficult to really understand how you can piece together both of those identities in a way that doesn't. I was really touched when you said I feel authentically Catholic, because that's one of the challenges, right? When you look
Yeah.
at Messianic Judaism, for example, a lot of people turn to heresy to feel more
Mm-hmm.
Jewish or to sound more Jewish. And
Mm-hmm.
that's one trap we need to avoid. And then the
Mm-hmm.
other one is that we don't want to cosplay our tradition. We want to live it out authentically. And I do think it's easier here in Israel, where that's
Sure.
just the culture.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it's an enormous privilege and it's an enormous challenge. And everybody I know who's in the middle of this Venn diagram, the main concern for everybody is how do we pass that on to the next generation in a way that's intact and coherent.
Right.
Um, and
Right.
that's one of the main
Exactly.
things that we're trying to kind of spin all the plates.
Yes. I think the way that you worded it is so perfect, that it's intact and coherent. And because people get confused about, there's so much confusion with like, in my most like the podcast we released on what does it mean to read Judaize Catholicism, right? People can immediately jump to like, oh, this is heresy, this is dual covenantness.
Right,
They don't, you know, they don't
right.
understand what St. Paul was talking about, in terms of like what you let go and what you keep. Um, so there's a lot of work there. There's also like the problem of replacement theology, which is also wrong. Because again, Jesus says, I have come to fulfill, not abolish, so there's all
Right.
these different. So I think you, in your personhood, hold this beautiful tension of how do you pass on your Jewish, again, tradition in a way that is coherent and doesn't scandalize and does, because as I can imagine, I make up and you can comment on this, that you're making some Jews mad for obvious reasons and then others for not obvious reasons, and then making some Catholics mad probably for silly reasons. So,
It's
uh,
it's all a very interesting conversation, because you're right, a lot of Jews are upset. Jews actually have very mixed reactions. Some people will be upset. The
mhm,
people I meet who are the most upset tend to be very, very slightly religious people. Um, just secular Jews don't really care because I'm culturally the same as they are, and actually
right,
probably agree with Orthodox Judaism on more points than they do,
right.
being a believing
Mhm.
person to begin with. Um,
Exactly. There's
and
where it gets
very,
complicated and interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's more
Yeah.
overlap in doctrine between ultra Orthodox Jews and myself than ultra
Mhm.
Orthodox Jews and the regular, secular Israeli. Which sounds nonsensical, but that's exactly the situation. And then very religious people, most of the people I've spoken to, it just becomes a religious discussion about right and wrong and how do we analyze this. But they don't really tend to be mad as much as they just tend to disagree eventually.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the Catholic side, Judaizing is actually the first heresy, and it's
Mm-hmm.
in the Bible. So it started
Mm-hmm.
on very early, and it's the first time all of the apostles and everybody, all the bishops came together, was to treat the Judaizing heresy. So when people hear about us trying to kind of live out both of these, or it's not really two identities, it's kind of a twofold single identity, and
Right.
trying to explore the different aspects of it, that's the sense that a lot of people get. Um, so some of them get mad on the Catholic side for very silly reasons, and some of
Mm-hmm.
them have very understandable concerns because most Catholics, I think probably 99% of all Catholics, have never met anybody trying to do what most of us are doing.
Yeah.
So I can see why they're concerned. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where I was hoping that that podcast about re-Judaizing was going to, because we treated it in depth. If by re-Judaizing you mean this, then no, as you mentioned. If by re-Judaizing you mean that, then yes, absolutely, because
Yeah,
that's the more authentic expression of the
exactly.
Catholic faith. But it takes work. Being Catholic, you got to read. you.
A
It's
lot.
hard. It's a lot. Yeah, it's like it's because it's complicated.
Yeah.
Um, but I so appreciate you talking about it with me. What gets you down most? Because I think there's always this temptation in life to say, I don't, and I fall into it. I don't belong anywhere. You know, I'm not Armenian
Oh,
enough for the Armenians, and I'm not Egyptian enough for the Egyptians, and actually in my friend group, which is a mix of Syrian and Egyptians, they say, I mean, like they're like, oh, but you're culturally Egyptian, but you speak Armenian. So like then I just want to go be sad and I don't fit anywhere. So
yeah.
do you fall into or the Catholic thing too? Like I know how to be Roman even if I'm not Roman, but I'm not technically. So woe is me.
Yeah.
But do you have that
Oh,
temptation?
yeah, 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 100%. So on the day-to-day life, people don't really notice any difference between me and them. So most of the time you don't really feel the tension. But then every time something happens, or you're sitting with one group and the discussion gets a little bit deeper, you start to feel the fact that you're on the fringes of Israeli society, actually, because you're a
Yeah.
Christian and you don't
Yeah.
fit neatly into any of the frames. So I just had a month of reserve duty, and I was speaking to a guy from a different company than mine. And on my dog tags, I have a cross as well, a
Right.
crucifix. And he said something, and he very casually points at me and he says, "Yeah, like, Israeli Arabs, so and so."
No, I'm a Jew. I'm not an Arab.
Exactly. And I said, I'm not an Arab. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but not who I am. And he was like, "What do you mean you're not an Arab?
But
But
you're
the thing,
Christian.
yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of Christian are you then?" I said, "Well, I'm a Jewish Christian." And he was just so puzzled. He could not figure out what Jewish Christian meant.
Right.
And then
Like
you
it
really,
means Catholic, if by Catholic you understand what Catholic means.
yeah,
But yes.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So you really feel like an outsider in those moments. But then also, he did touch on a point where in Israel, there are basically two kinds of Christian: foreign workers, immigrants,
Mm-hmm.
and Arabic speaking communities. Some of them identify as Arabs, some of them don't. That's not really, that's for them to decide.
Right.
But if you go to an Eastern liturgy here, it's most likely going to be in Arabic. So you don't really share the same culture exactly,
Right.
not all the same intuitions and sentiments. So the only place you really, really fit in is with the five friends that you have that are exactly what you are, and that's about it.
Right. And and so that's where Roman Catholicism makes more sense for you in some
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
certain way. Yeah, because it's
yeah.
just sometimes it's just it's culturally too hard. I get that. I have a family friend who is a Catholic from Cairo who's of a Jewish background, whose parents were Jewish and Coptic, and they became Catholic so they could like it. I mean, it's a whole other story from their time. I don't know why I had to mention it now, but just in the sense that like sometimes the like thing that you didn't expect is actually the place that you end up feeling the
Yeah.
most belonging.
And just
So
as a side note, I think that's something a lot of people don't understand when they talk about the Middle East. Westerners tend to think of what's going on here and the 5,000 different conflicts that we have running at the same time as
Mm-hmm.
running along very clean lines. It's the French against the Germans, it's the Brits
Right.
against the Scots, and it's really not. It's,
Right.
Israel isn't just, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't just Israeli Jews and Muslim Arabs. You have Christians on both sides. You have different kinds of Christians. Within the
Yeah.
Christian communities, you have different ethnicities. It's a mess, and almost everybody I know, especially in the non-Jewish world here, has, his mom is a Melkite, and his dad is an Armenian, and his grandmother
Mm-hmm.
was an Orthodox Christian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everybody's kind of a mix, and everybody has this puzzled identity.
Yeah, it's really hard to explain. It's real to Westerners. That's what one of the most stressful questions to me is like, "What are you?" Because,
Yeah.
well, because of
How
what you
much time
just
do you have?
how much time is what you just described is my family. So I'm like, okay, how much do you care? Were you just looking for a quick answer? But
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
so we should take time to talk about that with like because you were a medic in the IDF, and served in the war, and I just want to hear what that was like for you, especially with all these like complications, and also like what do you want besides what you just said? What do you want Americans and Westerners and Roman Catholics in the West to like know about that? I mean, I think what you pointed out was like probably one of the most important things that it's not simplistic, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'll start with the last question because I think it's really pressing.
Yeah.
The main thing I'd like anybody who's not from here and who's not fluent in either Arabic or Hebrew to know is that you don't have to have an opinion, and it's fine.
Mhm.
Not only is this vastly outside your sphere of influence, um, you need to be really well educated on a conflict to be able to voice an opinion in a way that's informed. So I'll take,
Right.
for example, the what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. I have a vague opinion. I have vaguely a side that I'm on, but I really can't understand the claims on either side. Some people say
Right.
Ukrainians and Russians are one people. Some people say they're not. I don't speak Russian well enough to consume any media in Russian. I don't speak Ukrainian at all. I just don't know. So I'm not really entitled to an opinion on the conflict in any dogmatic sense of the word.
Right.
Um, and it really irritates me when you hear people voice very strongly held opinions, and then within two questions, everything falls apart, and you realize they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about.
They have
They
no
don't know the
idea.
history. They don't know what's going on now,
Right.
and it can be very frustrating, regardless of which side they're on. I mean, even if they're pro-Israel, it still irritates me.
Yeah.
So that's the main thing for me.
I hear you. Because even people who know things still don't know everything. And there's
Yeah.
a lot to know. Yeah. I like what you said because it takes us back to the personal vocation.
Hmm.
There's a sphere of influence that you have in building up the kingdom of God. And that is your little sphere and that you ought to do well. And
Exactly.
people just everyone has like become an influencer. Everyone's like a geopolitical expert. And in terms of like the work of Philos Catholic and combating anti-Semitism and getting Catholics to tap into their Hebraic and Near Eastern roots, like on a very simple level, all we're really advocating for is that Catholics combat anti-Semitism, especially in the church. That's not you don't have to be an expert in anything to
Yeah.
know that that's sinful.
Yeah.
And then
And
when it comes,
sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, go ahead, please. No, please.
You ask what gets me down the most, and that's it. It's the fact that this conflict has been a trigger for a disproportionate amount of anti-Semitism. That's anti-Semitism for anti-Semitism's sake. It's not
Yeah,
really a political opinion about the conflict, and it's not really anything. It just
right,
gave way to a lot of people, even within the church, even prominent figures with a lot of following,
right.
to, even if not be outright anti-Semitic, be,
Accidentally,
yeah,
in
or
a
at
way.
least careless in the way they phrase themselves,
Yes,
if not suggesting in the way they phrase themselves, which is very common as well.
right.
Um, and it's just frustrating for a number of different reasons. One, whatever the Talmud does or does not say about Jesus and Mary is irrelevant to the conflict.
Right.
Two, if your goal is to baptize all nations, which it should be, you're not helping. If you want to
Definitely
if
not.
you want to help Jews
Absolutely
come to
not.
Christ, that's not the way to do it. It's failed for 2,000 years for a reason. Um, and just overall, racism is not a Christian quality. I don't know where that idea came from, but God does not show
Yeah.
favoritism in any nation and ethnicity. Anyone who worships Him is beloved.
I have to
Um,
say that, yeah, the thing that gets me down about it too is obviously like in our own church when you see it, because you're like, wait a minute, like we have like decades, centuries of anti-Semitism to like do spiritual reparation for. So
yeah,
like no need for more. Especially after Vatican II and great saints of modern popes of the 20th century who are, really helpful in Jewish Catholic relations. But yeah, are you really going to convert a Jewish person by, you know, like acting that way?
yeah.
And
I
I don't
mean,
know. Yeah, go ahead,
if you just
please.
look at the numbers, over 1900 years of the church being not anti-Semitic, but um, Jews, for the most part, were expected to assimilate when they converted,
Mm-hmm.
and the conversation between Judaism and Christianity was very polemic and not very apologetic. And you see this very small number of Jews who converted over 19 centuries, and then since World War II, the Christian world started to change its attitude, and now you have so many people. Unofficial estimates talk about 30,000 Christians, Jewish Christians, living in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pretty good chance that alone, that number is more than the entirety of honest conversions during the last 19 centuries.
Wow.
Uh, so, I mean, you don't attract flies with vinegar.
Right.
So
That is such incredible data. You don't, and it's not Christ-like, obviously.
that's right.
So
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel, and maybe I should just ask you how you feel about evangelizing Jews, but there's something in me that feels very allergic to that. And I consider myself an evangelist at heart. Like I think anybody that knows me on a personal level knows like I I am, that is like the core of who I am, but like with my actual in real life Jewish friends, I have never ever felt that I need to evangelize them ever because
Yeah.
because they're actually believing and practicing Jews. It would never even cross my mind. Now, if they said they're converting to Catholicism, I would be like super happy. I'd be like, of course.
Yeah.
But I have never felt like they're this project that I need to convert. And I'm sure as someone's listening to this, they'll think I'm a bad Christian or Catholic. Maybe you do, Yarden. I don't know. We haven't talked about this, but the only Jewish friend that I've ever evangelized, I would say in like a formal way, is my Jewish friend who's kind of a Buddhist ish and like was an atheist. And that's where I felt like, and who's, we had those conversations where I was like, have you ever thought about Jesus? It was organic. It wasn't
Right. Right.
it was born out of authentic conversation and friendship. So how do you feel about that? Maybe we disagree on this. I don't know.
I so I do think obviously that everybody in the world should become Catholic. Two things I think people need to keep in mind is that we've seen that historically evangelizing Jews in the sense of sending missionaries has not worked. Um, and one of the reasons is the second thing people need to keep in mind is that Jews are quite rightly sometimes as concerned about their culture and heritage as they are about theology.
Right.
And if you expect them to assimilate, and if you expect French Jews to just become French, that's not going to work. So I think before the church can intelligently talk about evangelizing Jews in the classic sense, it needs to know how to contain what Father Antoine Levy calls in his book, Jewish Church, Israel qua Israel. It needs
Mm-hmm.
to know how to have a corporal entity within the church where Jews can be Jews while being Catholic. And until we have that, I don't think there's any way we can do any serious missionary work to begin with. And I do think people should also keep in mind that even you see it from Vatican II in the Catechism, Jews are not quite in the same category as everybody else. Pope Benedict XVI said we can view Judaism as extrinsic to our faith, but it's somehow intrinsic to Catholicism. It's like the
Absolutely.
outermost circle in this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you can be a French Catholic, but as a Catholic, there's you have to be kind of Jewish. Like that's I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that's like the point. And it's funny because this whole like work of combating Catholic anti-Semitism, it feels Catholic. I literally truly believe if Catholics read their Bibles in a deep way, with Dr. Brant Petrie or someone who's like really opens up the Old Testament and the Jewish roots, we're going to have so much explosive philo-Semitism. Like Catholic
absolutely,
anti-Semitism won't exist,
absolutely.
and I think I love what you said. And in my, at least little sphere of influence right now, I just, Sherry Woodell in her book, Forming Intentional Disciples, talks about these thresholds of conversion. And the first one is just building trust. Jews don't have trust of Catholics for good reason.
Yeah,
So, like, why are we even going to talk about evangelizing Jews? I'd love to maybe get there in a serious way, as you said, but like when there's like not even trust. I mean, I was just talking to a Jewish friend recently, and he's like, "Do you guys still teach that the Jews killed Jesus in like religion class?" I'm like, "Never. I never heard that. Never once, ever." And he goes, "Really?" I go, "Yeah." I'm like, "That's where we're at.
yeah,
That's where we're at, church." So I don't want to hear about any of the other stuff till that is like completely understood as a modern myth. What is your opinion then of, and I want to get to your conversion story too, or at least a little like a mini conversion story. The word Zionism and Catholic Zionism. How do you feel about that? Big
it took me a
question.
while. Yeah, it is. It is. It took me a while to catch on that when people say Christian Zionism, they don't usually mean what I understood to be Christian Zionism. I just thought they meant Christians who are Zionists. And turns out that at least in some circles, there's a lot of baggage to Christian Zionism that I haven't caught on to, where the Zionism is extremely theological more than anything else.
Right.
Um, I'll just say this. For me, the basic premise of Zionism is as follows. Jews are entitled to self-determination in their indigenous homeland. That's
Right.
it.
Yep.
Anything else is your specific flavor of Zionism. It could be
Right.
based on how you understand prophecy. It could be based on geopolitics. It could be based on, the narrow interests of your own group in the Middle East. That's all fine. And that's why I think anti-Zionism is a problem. Because if you think every other nation on earth deserves that self-determination in their ancestral homeland, except for Jews, there's a name for that. That's a
Right.
problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, the journey came like when I used to work at a women's apostolate, I never liked the word feminism, right? Because there's so much connotations to it,
Right.
right? Am I pro woman? Yes. And am I pro Catholic woman in the Catholics? Edith Stein, John Paul. Yes. Do I like the word feminist? Even pro life feminist? No, I don't like it. Does John Paul
Right.
II himself use it? Yes. He says we need a new feminism, right? Like, but I never like any isms because I don't like ideologies. I don't even like the word Catholicism. I like the Catholic faith, right? This is the Catholic
Yeah.
faith, the faith of the person of Jesus Christ. That's it. So with Zionism, I'm like, oh, like we shouldn't use that word here because we're not into isms. But then I'm living like in Delulu land where, but in real life, we do use the word Zionism. But it just seemed insane to me that like the Zionist movement was fulfilled. There is a state called Israel. It exists and it needs to just continue to exist. And the
That's
fact
it.
that this is like still a thing is so absurd to me that we have to have a label for it. So yes, I think Catholics should embrace the phrase, even with Catholic Zionism, and say, as I do with feminism. If by feminist you mean pro-choice, no. If by feminism you mean, all the good things about being a woman and pro-life, yes. If by Zionist you mean evangelical, eschatological, ushering in the second coming, no. All I mean
Exactly.
is, all I
Exactly.
mean is that a country that already exists gets to exist. That's
Yeah.
it. So,
I heard a podcast in the I think it was Letters from Home. It was one of Dr. Scott Hahn's podcasts. And Dr. Scott Hahn, I love him. So what I'm about to say is I don't mean to disrespect him in any way. If I remember correctly, the podcast was entitled "Can Catholics Be Zionists?" and the short answer was no. And
Yep.
his explanation was exactly what you said. All of this extremely Protestant um, theological ideas that stand behind some people's Zionism. And
Right.
I'm listening to that, and I'm just thinking to myself, well, sure, but you just said Catholics can't have a very specific flavor of Zionism that I think most people don't even hold to. That doesn't
Right.
mean Catholics can be Zionists per se. And that probably has to do with the environment that he came from and that he operates within today. Maybe it is very common in the United States. I don't know, but among my
It just
European
gets
friends and here,
Yeah, it just gets like Zionist just means evangelical Zionism. There's
yeah,
no like,
right, right,
but I think we need to popularize Catholic Zionism, like,
right, yeah,
and to strip it of all of the theological stuff. Now, and this is like my personal thing. Do I think that there is a like you, Yarden, as a Jewish Catholic in Israel, like embody of like a spiritual prophetic, I don't know, like you're a real, yeah, but that's like spirituality. That's not political.
right, right. If
Yeah,
you want to say Catholics can hold to the view that the Jewish return to the land of Israel is eschatological and hastens the second coming, that's fine. That's a discussion we can have, but that's a theological discussion. That's not
right,
really a discussion about Zionism.
right.
Because if Zionism hadn't happened, we could still have that discussion in a theoretical way. And it's important for people to understand that local Christians, like we said before, it's not cut along straight lines. So when I was in Gaza, I met Catholics, I met Orthodox Christians, a lot of Orthodox Christians. I know, for example, there are a lot of Protestants, Israelis, Jews who serve in the IDF.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Maronites who serve in the IDF.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't really say if you're saying Catholics or Christians can be Zionists, you're saying many thousands of people here are not
Don't get their
entitled to be.
country, their own
Yeah, they're
country.
not entitled to be
The
patriotic.
Arameans and the Maronites and the yeah, who serve in
Exactly.
the ID, or the Druze that live in Israel. Like they don't get what do you
Exactly.
I don't even like the phrase pro-Israel. Like when I talk about the Philos Project, I don't even like using that phrase because I'm like, why do we have to even say it? It is a country that already exists. I
Right.
don't criticize America and then go, but I'm pro-America. I just criticize my country because it's my country and it's not perfect like every country.
Exactly.
Or when I argue with Catholics about, well, 1948 and the state of Israel and its founding, and I go, okay, so the way America was founded wasn't sh- like,
That's right. It's like saying
yeah,
you could say Catholics can be American patriots because the United States is fundamentally a Masonic project.
right.
Sure, but that's irrelevant to actually living as an American today.
It is, and it's irrelevant to what you said earlier in the episode, which is I have this one little sphere of influence, this one little corner of the kingdom of God that I am to like bring him to. Is that argument really like, do you want to dismantle the country? Because I probably
Exactly.
think you don't want to do that, but you just want to be mad at it. And
Right.
I don't know. And then you
And
don't even want
especially
to say like we also contributed to the conditions which made it absolutely necessary in our world.
exactly, which is everybody when they look at history, they choose the cutoff point very conveniently for political reasons. And Zionists do this, and anti-Zionists do this, and everybody does this. But I think the focus, the solution to this is actually what Dan Burke said in your podcast. He said
Nice.
instead of viewing this primarily through a political lens, the paradigm should be spiritual first.
Yeah.
And if you do that, Jesus didn't say, judge between nations and dismantle some. He said, baptize all nations. That
Yeah.
included pagans, that included very corrupt nations, that included very morally corrupt nations. So instead of talking about whether or not Palestinians and Israelis should exist, maybe we should view this in a more spiritual way and say, okay, they both do exist. Whether or not it's a 75-year project or a 3,500-year project. It doesn't actually matter for me today. The only thing that
Right.
matters for me is I want peace and I want everybody to come to Christ. And is my rhetoric achieving any of this?
Amen. Grab your rosary beads and make use of
Exactly.
it.
Exactly.
Totally. Yarden, you're so great. Okay, we have three more things to talk about before I say goodbye to you. One is, can you share a little bit about how you became a Catholic and that beautiful
Yeah,
story?
sure. Um, so when I was 16, I met with friends and I started talking to this one girl about the existence of God in a very vague, very general sense. And I was an atheist at the time. And I decided to disprove the existence of God, which for some reason I decided to start with Christianity just because I thought Judaism is just too complicated to to deconstruct.
It'll be
Um,
much easier.
yeah, yeah. Little did I know. Um, and I ended up on this website that just compared messianic prophecies and the fulfillment. And I didn't know a lot about Bible history, but I knew Mark and John lived very far on the timeline from, Jeremiah and Isaiah. And I did open my Hebrew Bible to see that it's not a translation problem. But interestingly, a lot of the messianic prophecies are actually very clear, even to modern Israel. So, for example, the book of Daniel, a lot of it is in Aramaic, and not everybody can read it fluently. But Daniel chapter 9 is one of the chapters that's in Hebrew. And I think it's in pretty clear Hebrew. It's pretty easy to get to the right conclusion if you read it.
Neat.
So I started looking for different churches. I ended up contacting Catholics. And I'm a minor at this time. I'm 16 or 17. I had this
So
dream and
great.
I decided I wanted to get baptized. So I talked to mom and dad, and that went very, very badly.
Not good.
Not
Not
good.
good. Not
Uh,
good. I had a feeling.
yeah, yeah. Because in Israel, of course, to be baptized, you need written consent from both parents if you're a minor. Otherwise, nobody will look your
Right,
way.
because your identification changes, right? Like
Yeah,
the
and
yeah,
it's actually illegal to try to convert minors, and the law is not specific from which religion to which religion.
right.
So it's just illegal to try to convert minors generally. You need written consent. Um, so then I tried to kind of find a way that harmonizes my new faith with my identity and my heritage. And I traveled through different circles of Messianic Judaism until I heard that girl I was speaking to back then was studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I said, kind of, I did this, I have to undo this because I got her reading the New Testament to begin with. Um, Through our discussions, which I felt at the time were very Bible based, we both ended up becoming Jehovah's Witnesses and getting married. This
Wow.
was 2013, so I was
Wow.
21, 22. Um, and we were there for about a decade.
Wow.
2019, we moved to Austria. And then at the very beginning of 2020, I remember it was Lent during COVID. So just before that, I started. So with the witnesses, they have their narrative of Christian history is vital to their theology. Kind of like how with Catholicism, if you think of apostolic succession, if you can positively disprove apostolic succession historically, the theology of it falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
Because apostolic succession is a teaching that's grounded in actual historical events of the laying on of hands from bishop to bishop. And if you can prove that Jane was broken and one of the bishops at a certain point just ordained himself, for example, then it's theologically a problem, not just historically. So with the witnesses, without getting into the weeds too much, um, they hold to a pretty extreme view of the great apostasy, where after Saint John died, there was no leadership, and within just a few years, the entire system collapsed. Until in the 1900s, it was kind of rediscovered by Charles Taze Russell, and they think that the way they believe today, which is a form of Arianism essentially, is what the original Christians held to. And I started being exposed to historical facts that just slowly cracked that idea. So I found out, for example, there's a group called the Apostolic Fathers of people who actually knew the apostles, and they write unanimously across the entirety of the Roman Empire about things like the deity of Christ. And they're not trying to convince anybody of the deity of Christ. It's just a given for them.
Yeah.
Or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, things that are completely antithetical to every single view that I held. So I talked to a lot of people, a lot of high-ranking friends that I had in the organization. And I wrote to the organization itself, and I really, I think I can say with a clean heart that I did everything I could to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually the questions were not answered, because it's not just the specific question about the deity of Christ, it's the ripple effect. So, for example, if you use the Protestant canon of Scripture, and you say that the church got the canon wrong, but that was essentially for 1500 years, the Christian canon was closer to what Catholics have than what
Right.
Protestants have.
Yeah.
How can you trust this 27 canon New Testament? So
Right.
if you don't believe in the deity of Christ, maybe the entirety of the Gospel of John is a forgery that shouldn't even be in the Bible. And
Right.
unless you have some extra biblical source like tradition, you end up with very circular reasoning of, I trust the Bible because I have this faith, and I have this faith because of what I think the Bible says.
Right.
So I just had to leave eventually.
Yeah.
And then November 11th, 2021, I was baptized and into the Catholic Church in Vienna,
Mm.
in the
Mm.
Kaisersjubiläumkirche.
Fancy.
Yeah,
Fancy.
it was
Love it.
uh, it was very nice, because a lot of different elements of my personality kind of came together in that church. And then
Oh, I
shortly
love that.
thereafter, I came back to Israel, and yeah, here we are today.
So beautiful. What a great, great story. That's like a little bit smidge similar to my story, where I was like, if I trust this, then I have to trust that. So
Right,
there you
right.
you know. And I didn't want to be Catholic. Like I was done with it. I was so annoyed, But back to Scott Hahn again. He's like the gateway drug to conversion. I read a few of his
Absolutely,
books and went, okay, all right.
absolutely.
Here I am. Here I am.
Yeah, Scott Hahn and Bishop Barron were two of like the real driving forces behind my conversion, because it's the beauty, the overwhelming beauty of the Catholic faith, and just how extremely intellectual this faith is, and how
Yeah.
robust everything is. Once you see it, you just cannot see it anymore.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said intellectual, because we have to love God with our whole minds as well as everything else.
Yeah,
And the respect for the intellect is something that brought me back in, because my emotions definitely didn't want to be there. I was like mad at Southern Cal. I was mad. I was like, I didn't, I was going to go be something more exotic.
yeah,
But yeah, it was the intellectual. And then I actually met very Hebraically formed Catholics who who would celebrate Shabbat actually, that were very well formed intellectual Catholics that were doing this. So it's just kind of funny that where I am now. So
yeah.
full circle, Yarden. Okay, so I have a friend that I'm very close to that thinks that Jewish Catholic relations or Jewish Christian relations is just all fake. Has nothing to do with the other, and he's not Jewish. He's Christian.
Yeah.
He's not Catholic, but he's Christian, and kind of a fallen away Christian. But I'm going to say on his way back, because I have to believe that. So, what do you have to say to him?
I think the first thing would be, make sure you actually know Judaism when you say that.
Mm,
Um, because most of the argumentation I've seen to favor that point, it's a straw man of Judaism that they have in mind. And it's a very
yeah,
weak straw man at that. For example, people say the Talmud says, and then they'll quote one line out of thousands of lines, and they don't really know how to read the Talmud. It doesn't quite work like the Bible, where
right.
every
Yeah,
sentence is dogmatic. You have to read it a certain way, you have to study it a certain way. And unless you do that, you're not going to understand it. So that's kind of that should be your working premise, is I need to understand Judaism on its own terms. And this is not just true of Judaism. You have to know to understand everything on its own
right,
terms, because if you only view
right.
it through your paradigm, you can't really criticize it intelligently. Um, and then the other thing I'm going to say is that throughout history, the tension between Judaism and Christianity caused both sides, I think, to intentionally try to move away from each other at certain points.
Mm,
But
right.
as much as everybody tried, everybody failed. And if you look deeply into both traditions, you understand that they are very, very similar, and the paradigms are incredibly similar.
Yeah.
like I said in the beginning of this recording, the people it's easiest for me to have religious discussion with are very religious Jews, more than Messianic Jews, by the way, who just tend to
Mhm.
be Protestants, because the way I think, the way I solve theological problems is much more similar to the way ultra Orthodox Jews do than
Yep.
Protestants.
That doesn't surprise me. I have my own analogy of that, but yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So those are two very, very important things. The more I delve into both of these traditions, and I have a lot of Gentile Christian friends, obviously, and I have a lot of non-Christian Jewish friends, and we talk about these things. The more it seems, you know how in past decades the church is kind of encouraging Byzantine Christians, for example, to kind of rediscover their own traditions
Mhm.
and use Orthodox materials to do that. And the more you dig into it, you see that it's not a difference of theology, it's a difference of expression and emphasis and
Yep.
vocabulary.
Absolutely. Yep.
And Judaism, even today, is a lot of different strings of thought about different topics. It's not, there's no magisterium per se. So
Right.
within the Jewish tradition, it's much easier than people think to find the exact same ideas we hold, or very similar ideas to many of the things we hold in Catholicism. Obviously, you're not going to find exactly the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist, right? Or the Trinity, but a lot of language that's
Yeah.
similar enough theologically that we can start to have this discussion.
Yeah.
And I've been able, the best I've been able to do with explaining the Trinity to Jews is when I learned to use Jewish terminology to
Mm.
explain what we hold to. Because here, when you switch to using Greek and Latin terms, it's not going to
Right.
do anybody any good.
Not gonna work. Yeah.
Yeah,
What a gem. What a gem you are. And I can't wait to see all the things that God will continue to do with your life and
thank you.
and your walk with him. So on that note, because I have so many more questions and I'm gonna be disciplined. You're working on two really great projects. One is a
Yeah,
pilgrimage and one is a Bible translation project. So before we say goodbye, could you let our listeners know what those are and how they can get involved if they'd like to?
yeah, absolutely. So with the pilgrimage, this year, everything lines up really nicely with Passover. Passover is going to be overlapping with Holy Week, and Julian and Gregorian Easter are the same
I'm
day.
so excited, and it's the Jubilee year too.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's the what 1700 anniversary of
Anniversary of the
Nicaea.
Council of Nicaea. Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
the 10-year anniversary of the Coptic martyrs. So
Oh
as a,
yeah, that's right.
yeah, Coptic
So it's
Catholic
it's a lot
friendship.
of
So there's a
really
lot
cool
of graces
things
next year. Yeah.
converging.
Yep.
So we're kind of striking the iron while it's hot, and we're doing a pilgrimage it's mainly focused for Hebrew Catholics, so Catholics of a Jewish background, but uh, Christian Jews of other denominations are more than welcome, and of course, our Gentile brothers and sisters are welcome to come. It's going to be April 10th through 20th. We're going to have prayers together. We're going to have Shabbat together. We're going to have the Passover Seder together. And all of this is going to be in the light of Christ. So we're not doing anything just as a cultural exercise. It's all going to have Christian spiritual value to it.
Amazing.
And then the last day of the pilgrimage is actually Easter Sunday. So we're very excited about that. I'll give you
That's
my
so,
email, which
so
you can
exciting.
post.
I
Any,
wanna go.
you're more than
I
welcome.
I wanna come. It's all in Israel? All of
It's
it?
all in Israel, yeah.
Amazing.
And the itinerary was formed with a Hebrew Christian tour guide and the sites. We didn't just take, a cookie cutter itinerary for this. We constructed this together to have Jewish point of interests and Christian point of interests, and then a few different gems, especially in Galilee, where the two traditions converge into the same holy site. So it's going to be really, really interesting. And we've taken into consideration the fact that it's Holy Week as well. So the Triduum for the itinerary for the Triduum takes into account Holy Friday and everything else. It's going to be fascinating. It's going to be really cool. And anybody who wants to come can contact me via email, and I'll give him all the information and the sign up form. The
Incredible.
second project is the first ever Catholic Bible in Hebrew. So as from what I
Amazing.
know, we have this project going on, and there's another one kind of parallel to it, and they're going to have slightly different characters. Ours is not going to be an official church translation, which is important for people. It's not going to be for liturgical use, but it is going to be approved by local church authorities. Where the idea is to put the Catholic canon together in a way that's natural and approachable for Catholic and Orthodox Christians who are from a Jewish background. So the translation we're going with for the New Testament, the way we're doing the deuterocanonical books, some of them, the Hebrew original is lost to us. It's going to be very carefully done so that the entire thing feels very sacred and very prayerful for people who grew up within the Jewish tradition. Because a lot of, for example, the New Testament translation that's common today uses, they've moved away from using Old Testament Hebrew. So it's very understandable, but it doesn't hit quite the same way when you move from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So we're trying to aim this to feel very prayerful and very sacred throughout the process. But also, since this is the first Catholic translation, we're also working with a team of experts in Aramaic and Greek and everything else to make sure the theology is sound, and make tiny tweaks where we have to. So, for example, the no Hebrew translation has full of grace for Mary. They all have something kind of similar to it, but not quite. So all those tiny little changes to kind of really highlight the Catholicity of the Bible, which is a Catholic book, but also to make it fit very authentically into Israeli and Jewish culture. So it's a historical, very, very exciting project. And for that, most of what we're looking for is actually just donations, because it's a lot of work and people are going to be involved in this. And printing a book is not an easy project.
No, it's not. My goodness. Okay, we have to raise money for that. That is amazing. Okay.
Yeah. So you can just donate to the AHC, to the Association of Hebrew Catholics, under whose auspices this is going to be, and just make some kind of note saying this is for the Bible translation program, and we'll find a way to make it work on our end.
Amazing, Yarden. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm grateful for you.
Yeah, me too.
And I hope to see you next year in Jerusalem.
Amen.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
If this episode was helpful for you, please consider sharing it with a friend, leaving a rating and review to help us spread the word, and donating at philosproject.org/give with the comment Catholic to support this podcast. To learn more about becoming a Christian leader in the Near East, check out our Pathfinder free online courses, also on our website. Thanks for listening. See you next week.